My name is Andy Flattery. I'm the owner of Flattery Wealth Management, a registered investment advisor. All opinions expressed by me and my guests are solely our own opinions and do not reflect the opinions of Flattery Wealth Management. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and should not be relied upon as investment, tax, or legal advice. Clients of Flattery Wealth Management may maintain positions in Bitcoin and the securities discussed in this podcast. Johann Kurtz, thank you so much for joining. It's great to chat with you.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you very much for having me.
Congrats on the book. I am on the John Hancock chapter right now.
Okay.
John Hancock wearing his finery.
Indeed, yeah. No, he's. I'm an Englishman, so the only Americans I identify with are wannabe aristocrats.
Well, right. Yeah. It reminded me of Mark Zuckerberg used to talk about how he only wore the hoodie, as we all remember. And I think that was kind of celebrated. And I don't know, Mark Zuckerberg, I'm sure he's changed his mind on things as a lot of us have. But now I think one of the points you make in the book is like, of course, John Hancock, maybe he was a bit of a dandy. However, he was also setting an example. So if he dresses well, then maybe that will encourage the lower classes to dress well as well too. And I bring up Mark Zuckerberg because it's like now you see it's not just you're wearing a cool hoodie; it's you go to the grocery store and people are wearing pajamas or something like that. So I'm not blaming Mark Zuckerberg, but there it is.
The Zuckerberg thing is unfortunate. I mean, I think it's understandable because, one of the things I lay out in the book is a theory of sociology drawing from E. Digby Boltzell, who's this wonderful American sociologist who coined the term WASP. That's one of the things he's famous for. And he was brought to my attention by Aaron Renn, the Christian social commentator, who's very good as well. And in Boltzell's sociology, there's this idea that first generation elites, men like Mark Zuckerberg, who are first made wealth, who are first generation wealth, self-made wealth, they necessarily have certain limitations in their cultural leadership because they typically have had technocratic or practical educations, like computer science at Harvard, as with Mark Zuckerberg. And there is, of course, nothing wrong with that. People need meritocratic success. But there is this unhealthy dynamic when those people become society's only elites. And suddenly we find ourselves with the people who are setting the cultural tone, the aesthetic tone for society, being the same people who, in approaching middle age will wear the same t-shirt every day. And at a certain point, without this sense of dynasty and legacy and cultivation that comes from these multi-generational families, which pass on aesthetic educations and expectations and so forth, you do have a world of Zuckerbergs and Musks and so forth, where there is, I think you see this more strongly in architecture. It is very felt, this sense that our elite today are not building beautiful buildings. And my theory is that has a lot to do with the fact that now contemporary America is dominated almost totally by first generation wealth, which is a sign of healthy social mobility, but may also be a warning sign that we've forgotten how to build lasting intergenerational things.
I don't know if you've seen this one yet, but I've got to pull this up. Have you ever seen this? This is called Innisfada. This is at the time when this was built over 100 years ago. I think this was one of the larger mansions in the United States. Johann, can you see my screen?
I can. Yeah. It's beautiful.
Yeah. So this is Nicholas Frederick Brady. And I haven't seen him in your book yet, but I was reminded of him because in your book, you talk about inculcating your family into institutions. And this gentleman, Mr. Brady, was the first American to receive the honor of the Supreme Order of Christ. So he was a papal duke. And he was an American. Unfortunately, he had no children. And as the story goes in my research, he left this beautiful mansion to the Jesuits, who 10 years ago sold it, and then it was demolished. So it no longer exists, very, very sadly.
No, that's a travesty. This is something that that we've been going through in the UK as well, which I sometimes draw attention to on my Twitter timeline, which is that the inheritance tax now means that it's simply, and various other changes in the economy mean that a lot of the great stately homes are fundamentally financially inviable. You can sort of scrape by turning them into a museum and inviting strangers into your house all day long, which is a little bit uncomfortable. But one was demolished to make way for a motorway called the M5, which is just a very, very, very sad story.
Well, it's, I guess where I really wanted to start with this was, it's been, I think, 15 years since this thing called the Giving Pledge. If you'll remember this was, I think, Warren Buffett and Bill Gates, they had committed at the time to donating most of their wealth to philanthropy, and they had encouraged others to do the same. I remember at the time, this was like somewhat well received. And I think now, like, a lot of us are viewing this with a lot more skepticism. Or maybe I'm just in a bubble, but I really think that your book has come at the right time. But you hear this all the time now, like Keith Richards is disinheriting his children. In my research for this conversation, I saw Jackie Chan, unfortunately, said that his son would not inherit his fortune because he said, quote, "If he is capable, he can make his own money. If he is not, then he will just waste my money." And then the one that's in your book that sort of broke my heart was Shaq. So Shaquille O'Neal said, "My kids are older now. They're kind of upset with me. I tell them all the time, we ain't rich. I'm rich. I'm not giving you nothing." So there's Shaq. And there's a number of these, as you know. So I guess to put the point back to you, Johann, and play devil's advocate here, what's the problem? I mean, maybe that's just tough love by Shaq. Why is this a bad thing?
I gave Shaq a bit of a hard time in the book because that ellipsis, it's actually a long section where he's talking about this. And he does say, like, he's not going to give his kids anything, but if they come to him with a professionally made business plan, he'd consider investing in their business. So he's at least giving them the sort of charity attention. Right. But others like Jackie Chan, it's the thing about the Jackie Chan statement is that there's an unannounced third option there, right? Which is, so Jackie Chan's laid out, if he's worthy, he'll make his own money. If he's unworthy, he'll lose mine. But if he was worthy and received my money, he could go on to do greater things than he could do if he was starting from zero, is presumably the missing option. And that's sort of the case for the book, is that this is really this lost third way. People don't think that it exists because there's this contemporary conception, and I think this is borne out in some of the quotes that you just provided, and also those in the book, some of the stories in the book, that money necessarily corrupts. But my hope is that the book lays out the theological, philosophical, and practical foundations rooted in history and the stories of the great men of the West that show that actually there is this repeatable path. There are a certain set of these, what I call 1,000-year families, who have passed on not just wealth, but an inherent way of doing things, which stewards children towards virtue and discipline and resilience, and creating these good and flourishing communities around their family estates, even in the face of wealth. That wealth does not necessarily corrupt. It is certainly a force for temptation, a mercurial force, but equally with intentionality, with the right framework when raising children, and indeed with faith, you can build up those defenses around a family. Now, my belief is that we're really struggling with this at the moment, in part because of this phenomenon of social mobility. There's this statistic, and I cited this in an article the other day that's very striking. There's a book called The Missing Billionaires, it's basically a risk management book by a couple of hedge fund guys. But in the beginning, they cite this incredible fact, which is that if the 1,000 wealthiest families in America in 1900, who they put somewhere around starting at 5 million and then going up into the hundreds of millions in net worth, if those families had invested sensibly, reproduced at the normal rate, spent at a reasonable rate for, wealthy or ultra wealthy individuals, the assumption mathematically would be that each of those 1,000 households would have turned into a total of 16,000 billionaire households now, just based on even fairly conservative investment returns. And yet, currently in the United States, there's only 700 billionaire families, and that's really only from a single cohort. One would have expected the incredible, the market and economic development in the 20th century to generate, maybe dozens or hundreds of cohorts of these new billionaires, and you would just expect to see far, far, far more billionaire families than you do today. And part of the reason for that is that with this fantastic opportunity for wealth creation, with this explosion of new families into the sort of ultra high net worth bracket, there hasn't been this commensurate explosion of knowledge of the practices that the old noble aristocratic families who managed to perpetuate their dynasties for centuries or a millennia in the case of the Grosvenors, the Dukes of Westminster, who I mentioned in the book, as someone that inherited 9 billion in trust, age 25, the current Duke of Westminster, and that fortune stretches back to 1066 in the UK, so almost 1,000 years. So my hope is that the book might make some small contribution to stabilizing that situation and engendering these dynastic conditions that I believe, and I try to show in the book, are necessary for a certain sense of cultural rootedness and the expression, the flourishing of higher, long-term, great generational projects in the domains of construction, beauty, aesthetics, culture, and so forth.
Well said. The other side to this that comes to mind, though, is like Americans, we like to cheer for success. We like rags to riches stories. There is a strain of American identity that is like pro-egalitarian at the core. And I'm not the best guy to talk about this, but if you know about like the Quakers, for example, they were sort of pro-egalitarian and they were influential. In fact, in places like Pennsylvania, which is mentioned in your book by the WASP chronicler. That's not like what mainline Protestantism was about. That's certainly not what American Catholicism is about, egalitarianism, that is. So I guess what I'm saying is maybe Americans are a little schizophrenic about this. Like, it's kind of egalitarian at times, but if you really look at it, personally, I think egalitarianism is kind of a fiction, like it's just against reality. But it does sort of beg the question, Johann, why direct this book to like an American audience? This seems like maybe a topic that's more Eurocentric. Certainly, listening to your wonderful voice, you're an Englishman. Why make this a book directed towards Americans?
Great question. So let me start by saying this: far be it from me to tell you about your own culture, but America is the history is great and diverse of different religions, denominations, geographical conditions, and so forth. And it is now assumed that America was this egalitarian project as opposed to the monarchist project in Britain from which it separated. But I don't think that's really true. I mean, in a place like Virginia before the Revolution, you had this, and indeed after the Revolution, you had this sort of cavalier aristocratic spirit. In a place like Boston, Massachusetts, you had Puritan ideals, which were sort of very hierarchical in nature. And, you had leading families of a place like Boston, which eventually developed into the so-called Boston Brahmins, the Cabots, the Adamses, and so forth. So you had these real dynasties. It is true that in places like Philadelphia with the Quaker ethos, you had competing philosophies, but there's a real strain in America that does and it's, that kind of stereotype of the WASP, multi-generational, successful, well-kept family with family businesses and so forth. So I think there's a real place for that in the American story. And I don't think I'm imposing anything on America that isn't well represented in the best of its history. As for why I focus on America, I would say two things. The first is that we all live in the UK and Europe and everywhere else now in the global American empire. You guys are the cultural centerpiece of the world, for better or worse. I think in many ways for the better. I'm a Christian, and I'm very heartened at how strong that faith still lives on in America compared to places like Britain. But also because one of the motivating factors for the book is to recognize that the greatest wealth transfer in history, which is the intergenerational transfers of inheritance, which will happen as the post-war generation, the baby boomers, near the end of their lives, is soon to happen. And I'm hoping that the book will have some small influence on the thinking of certain families who are considering carefully what their options are to leave a legacy, to structure their wealth, to pass on their wealth in a way that will set their families up for good. And, as the wealthiest nation in the world, and the most populous in the Anglosphere, I think America sort of has to be the centerpiece of that conversation. It helps that my mother's family are all American. So although I think it would be an exaggeration to call myself an American, I do have a deep love for your country and visit as regularly as I can. So I'm something of an Americophile, whatever the word there is. But no, I think America sort of had to be the cornerstone of the conversation.
Yeah. I guess there is a kinship there. The women want to know what Princess Kate is wearing. The men, we men want Prince Harry to pull it together. We like Prince Harry. And then, we watch all the PBS masterpiece theater shows, the Downton Abbeys. I'm speaking about myself here. So, it's funny. There's a kinship there. I hear what you're saying. There's so much wealth in this country. And if wealth is not paired with virtue, that's going to lead to disaster. And we're already seeing that. And so I think your book is coming at a really important time, and you go to great pains in the book to sort of lay the foundation for this. You kind of step by step go through the process of how you come to your conclusions. A lot of it draws on Christian virtue, but I also think like part of your larger project, and this is evident on your Substack too, Johann, is it's kind of part of like a broader project of like the re-enchantment of the world to me. I've seen this in some of your pieces. We're giving our children their history back. We're giving them an identity, a cultural lore that they can pass on to their own children. And I know that sounds a bit esoteric, but I don't know. I see that in your work. And like even in this book, you talk about Christmas, and you make the case that Christmas is one of the areas of our culture that, still has a bit of mystery, still has, sort of the Christian ethos. And if you don't mind, I want to read just a quick passage from your book. You say, well, why does Christmas have such staying power? Why do so many attend church on this day when they have otherwise abandoned the faith? How does the magic live on? Christmas offers us a model of how the world should be and how we must make it again if we are to pass on our beliefs to our children. Every detail is harmonious and intentional. The world is sacramentalized and every aspect is imbued with meaning. Word is bound to action through ritual, and a reifying unity is produced. I thought that was beautiful writing, and I agree.
Thank you. Yeah. There's a lot of I think well-intentioned and often completely correct effort put into this notion of re-enchanting the world. But I think part of that is difficult to do when it's not understood as a holistic project. So, what is re-enchantment? I think we have to be a little bit careful with that term because it's a sort of overly flexible term, which is as suggestive of magic as it is of that's why I use the word sort of sacramentalized reality, which is to notice that everything around us is part of an expression of, to put it simply, of God's creation, which is to say that everything, the mechanics of the universe sort of point back to this higher reality. And you feel consoled, you feel like you are part of something living when the world around you is ordered in such a way as to reflect that meaning, that directionality, that transcendence. And it's sort of difficult to re-enchant the world without living in an environment in which very particular aesthetics are cultivated, in which old things are preserved, in which we feel the generations who went before us as personal presences, and the generations who will follow as this kind of inescapable potentiality. And again, I think that is intimately tied up to this question of dynasty, this question of building things that are meant to last in the knowledge that, your children will live hopefully close to where you lived, that you can pass them on a community, that you can pass them on an estate and physical objects, perhaps the artifact of your parents before you and so forth. So it's sort of trite to say, but we live in a very disposable culture, and my contention is that has to do with a lack of ultra long time horizon thinking, planning, investment, and so forth. So yeah, and that again, like the Christmas as a ritual is part of that. In that a ritual is something that is repeated through time. It's this beautiful thing that you return to again and again as an assertion of continuity. And Christmas is the kind of canonical Western ritual because everyone knows the elements of the ritual, gathering around the tree, the giving of presents, if you're a Christian, going to mass and the singing of sacred songs and so forth. And it takes you out of the moment. It takes you back into this eternal time when you sing the same songs as your forefathers. And I think that is that when you step out into the cold, quiet air on Christmas night, that kind of re-enchantment of the world does flicker for a second.
And I think there's a tendency amongst some of us that are traditionally or conservatively minded to say, well, what we really want to do is go back to the halcyon days and figure out how Catholicism or Christianity was practiced back then, and we're going to go back to the old church calendar and do it that way because that's the real way it's done. And they had these different practices. But I think what's beautiful about this is like you're saying, well, this is the world we live in right now. I'm recognizing that Christmas is still practiced and it's done very well, and it's actually been passed down to us by our boomer parents and who we can criticize. I'm not going to, but I know that happens online, and I think that's a beautiful thing. Like you're not falling into this temptation of just saying, "Hey, let's go back and do this thing 1,000 years ago." You're saying, "No, I mean this is here right now. We can embrace certain aspects of our tradition that have been passed down to us, and we can emphasize it." There's not a lot, but there is some, and Christmas is maybe one of them.
Yeah, quite so. I mean, there's this concept in Christianity, in Catholicism. I mean, probably there's a version of this in many denominations of Christianity, which we call enculturation, by which we mean when a civilization comes into contact with Christianity for the first time. And I think we could extend that principle to when our civilization comes back into contact with Christianity, as hopefully it re-Christianizes. What Christianity calls it for in the cultural sense is not the replacement of the organic culture of that civilization. It's its perfection. So sort of respecting the legitimate cultural patrimony of a civilization while elevating whatever spiritual assertions or religious assertions they may have into the sort of majesty of the Christian faith. In other words, there's when you'll hear a lot of pagans say, well, this festival is really just a replacement of the pagan festival before. And to an extent that was often true and a completely intentional decision, which is to say that like there was a cultural calendar which was associated with a particular country for thousands of years. And the coming of Christianity into a space is not supposed to be an act of dislocation. It is supposed to be this act of perfection and transcendence. And I think you can imagine something similar happening to the contemporary West. Like there is a lot about the contemporary world that is eminently redeemable. I think a lot of modern music is good. I think the world has moved on, and it is not likely that we will reinstitute the liturgical calendar and the calendar of festivals and practices and appearances and so forth of several hundred years ago. I think that sort of, as you say, rosy traditionalist thinking, as fun as it would be to suddenly find ourselves back in the Christendom of the high medieval ages, I don't think that's realistic. So our task then becomes, this is our cultural patrimony, for better or for worse. How do we perfect it? How do we make it into the best possible thing it could be?
Yeah, I mean, on that note of something that's not going to score you a lot of trad points, but J.K. Rowling kind of had this figured out. I think every Harry Potter book had Christmas to the max. At the end of every semester, you had Harry celebrating Christmas, and they did a great job of it. They really kind of had the vibe, they had the aura of Christmas in the books, which I think you might appreciate, if I'm not mistaken, Johann.
That's right. Yeah. No, I'm a big, I sort of understand the hesitation of religious figures who say, don't give Harry Potter to your children. That's a world of witches, warlocks, and magic. But I do, I think that children can sort of understand and separate the fantastical elements of that story from the deeper themes. And I do believe that Christian themes are inherent in that story in the deeper sense. There's this. I wrote an article about this a while ago, which you might well have read. But if you look at the magic in Harry Potter, it's not like the sort of necromancy, summoning spirits and controlling them. There's none of that. It's much more incantational magic, where it's words you say which affects and changes the world. It's sort of like a reflection of how Christians, not quite, obviously there are limitations to this analogy, but conceive of prayer, which is that there is something biblical about, God spoke and the world was made, and we participate in our relationship with God and communion with God in the liturgy and so forth with this act of speaking. There's, speaking of this principle of enculturation, there was this funny period in the conversion of England from the older Anglo-Saxon paganistic theological systems, which was sort of animist, to the Christian world, where that was a more gradual process than you might imagine. It wasn't that suddenly like a light switch flicked on and everyone was Christian and going to church and understood everything about theological practice. There was this kind of in-between stage on their journey towards Christianity as we now understand it, where you'd sort of get like farmers saying a prayer over their fields as a sort of almost like a fertility ritual for the field. And it's kind of sensible to us now, but also it's something older. So yeah, my idea of the world of Harry Potter is that what Rowling's doing is telling this spiritual history of Britain. That's why it feels so English, but ultimately it comes to this totally Christian conclusion, which is Harry's sacrifice of himself, which is there's a sort of like Christ-like reflection in the conclusion of the book. I like it. Yeah.
You turned me on to this internet subculture that I think exists of like young people that are into Slytherin, and which of course I was appalled by when I first heard about it. But then the more I thought about it, I was like, actually, has Slytherin been vindicated? They're the defenders of tradition. They're holding up the ancient houses of England. The actor whose name escapes me, who played Draco Malfoy in the films, was like one of the kids that didn't betray J.K. Rowling. And so it occurred to me, maybe Slytherin House has been vindicated. They're not all bad.
Yeah, it's funny. This isn't what I was expecting to talk about on this podcast, but I can talk about Harry Potter all day because I don't think J.K. Rowling. I mean, I was going to say I don't think she knew what she was creating, but that sounds demeaning to her. Obviously, she has this incredibly rich conception of her project, but it's kind of like Harry Potter is this confused world from her own standpoint, in that J.K. Rowling was famously very poor and essentially working class when she created this world, and it is quite natural to have an organization within the world that sort of represents the worst excesses of the wealthy, of the aristocracy, and I think that's what she was trying to imbue into Slytherin. But of course, there is, as soon as you create a rich enough organization of that it doesn't feel real. It doesn't feel like a true antagonist unless it has some redeeming and realistic qualities, which indeed the kind of old multi-generational proud families of the aristocracy did. That strong sense of family, that strong sense of place, like there's a Slytherin Hall or whatever, I don't know what it's called, but like it's the place where these kind of like old relics of family members still contain, and obviously Lucius Malfoy has the best dress sense of anyone in the books, with that wonderful like hair and cane and so forth. So yeah, it's Harry Potter is basically like it's kind of a defense of the aristocracy in that for me, the star of the books is not only the characters. Like Harry's kind of a forgettable character. Ron is a sort of light comic relief. Hermione is kind of bossy, and Rowling is able to elevate those characters. But the real charm of it comes from like Hogwarts itself, which speaks to this deep fantasy that we all have of being whisked away from our mundane Muggle existence into something older, more profound, this older story, which with these like generations who have gone before of eccentric people who did wonderful and strange things, this sense that we're going to live our lives in a common room which 100 generations have slept in before us, that we share in their identity through the participation in this house system, that we all have to wear specific colors which demarcate our identities, that we live in this place filled with old stones warmed only by fire, in which, it's just this like yearning for a world, a basically aristocratic world of British boarding school that no longer quite exists. And it is quite wonderful.
Yeah, and despite the fact that Harry's not half Muggle. Hermione is half Muggle. Harry's a wizard, and it does matter who his family is. It does matter who his parents were. He's from a place. He's from his own legacy, and J.K. certainly recognizes that, even though he's not quote unquote nobility. His history matters. You walk by any painting in Hogwarts, there's a story there. There's a history. So yeah, I didn't mean to sidetrack this, but yeah, the thought occurred to me that Slytherin had been somewhat vindicated. I think for me, like a personal goal out of reading your book is to try to elevate my family, to try to elevate my family, to make the next generation better than the last. And I'm from a wonderful family, but certainly, there's no titles in the Flattery household. But it does strike me that like the nouveau riche, like the Shaqs or the Jackie Chans, I don't know how much money, I don't know how much wealth Jackie Chan has, but it is a lot to ask to have him essentially inculcate this virtue in his family, to create these sort of young nobles that can basically take the reins and run his estate after he's gone in a way that's, virtuous and befitting for a noble family. It's a lot. And so I think it's a lot to ask for the nouveau riche to do that. So where do you start? Like what are some of the ways that we can raise our children to be able to take over an estate? Because certainly there is a point. Like if you give a bunch of money to kids who are not virtuous, they're going to screw it up, and it's going to be a disaster. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I'm sort of sympathetic to Jackie's position. Jackie isn't in the book, so I don't know his whole story. But no, but from what I remember, because I have read about this before, he has something of a sort of crazy son, like famously. A son who probably couldn't be trusted as a responsible steward of great wealth. And, one of the things I'm trying to do in the book is to ask why that might be the case. I make the case that raising children in the context of great wealth is not like raising other children. It is a sort of high stakes, high reward game, in that this corrupting force is ever present. So, I address a few things in the book. One of them is some suggestions based on the practices of successful aristocratic families. And this is not a blanket defense for anyone in your audience who is rightly skeptical of the notion that the aristocracy do everything right. I don't think they do, but there are certain families, including, those from the sort of unofficial American aristocracy, successful multi-generational American dynasties who wouldn't regard themselves and indeed have no titles or anything like that, who do succeed in raising children again and again in the context of wealth without corrupting them. So there's a chapter devoted to this. There's sort of 3 chapters devoted to issues around this. The first is called Raising Children Worthy of Empires, which is about how to form children who have the discipline and sense of identity, sense of subservience to higher things, to the family, to the community, and to God, such that they have this source of strength to resist the temptations of wealth and to channel it in positive directions. The next chapter, Thousand Year Estates, details how you might actually configure the estate that you leave them in ways that lends itself to virtuous use, as opposed to just sort of liquid cash, which offers endless temptation. And then finally, there's this chapter called "How They Take Power," which is about how you initiate children successfully into the world of taking over the family business estate as a gradual process, rather than this light switch at the end of their life. But to answer your question directly, the sort of four elements of raising children and the element of wealth that I mentioned in the book, and you can tell me which ones you want to go into, are: never forget the normal practices and rituals of raising healthy children, ensure that your family has a strong faith and knows duties as well as privileges, impress upon your children your family's identity, mission, and values, and initiate children into structures beyond the atomic family.
Mm-hmm. The word duty is, I think this is becoming a more operative term, and it's directly opposed to our favorite book, this Die with Zero, which is not me picking on the author of the book per se, but the title of that book is sort of a meme to me. And I think what you're doing in your thesis here is you're saying, well, sure, we have certain privileges that wealth affords us, our success affords us, we've earned through our hard work and grit. However, there's certain duties that come with this great wealth. So what are the duties that come with great wealth? Why do we have duties?
Yeah, Die with Zero is an interesting book. I'm sure some of your listeners have read it. I have no compunction about picking on it because it's an immensely successful book, and Bill Perkins is a successful man. So I think you can, he'll weather the storm
punching up
of our criticism. Yeah, quite so. But it's if I was to offer a defense of Die with Zero, there is an element of useful truth in Bill Perkins' thesis, which is that most people have an unintentional relationship with wealth. They know that they are supposed to accrue it and they are supposed to preserve it, but they don't think far ahead about how they should use it, and they don't have a realistic conception of how much they actually have and how they're going to use it while they're alive. So what Perkins encourages his readers to do is say, okay, but actually let's model how much wealth you have now, how much you're likely to have over time, and let's place that against your life priorities, and let's make sure that you're allocating enough time in your life to achieve beautiful things that will convert into these wonderful memories for both you and your children. And let's make sure that you don't just work flat out till the end of your days and then die unfulfilled. And there's something very important there. But my contention is that his kind of thesis is it's kind of like the first step in getting out of Plato's cave, in that he says, wealth is not an end unto itself. And he's absolutely right in that. Wealth is something which should be used to achieve real world effects, to turn into real world events, to build real world things. And if you lose sight of that, then you can get caught up in this kind of fever dream of more wealth, more wealth, more wealth. What I think the domain in which he falls short is that he never quite escapes this hedonist ethic in the book. So all of the examples he gives about how to spend your wealth to achieve this paradigm he's setting out to are quite trite. He recommends this beach party he had, and it's kind of like it devolves quite quickly into the kind of into the meme of boomer cruises and golf, which is unfortunate because it sort of starts off in the right direction. The case I make in the book is that the way that societal inequality can be justified, and certainly the way that generational inequality can be justified, where an egalitarian society is preserved across time, and some people are born into wealth, and that can be a good thing, is if societal elites and over time, something that solidifies into an enduring upper class accepts their position of responsibility in the domains of spiritual leadership, taste, etiquette, aesthetics, accountability for the spiritual and physical health of the community around them. For this, if everyone around them has to work hard all day, every day on their technical field, as indeed most of us do, it is reassuring to know that at a higher level, people who are, part of what came to be known as the leisure classes are thinking about these matters and at a higher level, at a more holistic sense. I think that sounds ludicrous today because we're acutely aware that our current crop of elites have failed in that duty at a sort of civilizational level. But nevertheless, you still see this in small towns. You see this in particular cities, which are well run. There are billionaires today, there are centimillionaires today who have taken real responsibility for the elevation of their communities and made them more beautiful, safe places. They've patronized important institutions like the church, and they've really elevated the quality of life for their immediate surroundings. And those people are the kind of heroes of the book.
Yeah. Well said. And you make the point in your book that these people are doing it personally. Largely, they're involved in the sort of philanthropy that is not a racket, that is not sort of like financializing philanthropy where it's done through multiple intermediaries. They're invested, so they feel like they have a duty for their community and they're personally invested in it. And that's the sort of philanthropy that we kind of want. We don't want these philanthropic rackets where your wealth may or may not be used someplace halfway around the world in some place that may or may not be doing any good. You kind of want it in your community, in your circles where you can make an impact and where you can be held accountable because, we don't see that as much anymore.
Yeah, that's it's kind of interesting to imagine a counterfactual where Microsoft was never taken public and forever remained a family business, essentially, because I think you rightly expressed skepticism of the Gates Foundation project, and I kind of make the case in the book that this notion of philanthropy, when separated from this older community-focused love and personal relationships-focused vision of charity, becomes unmoored very quickly. And when you try to conduct charity along scientific lines in domains where science actually has relatively little purchase, the social sciences are famously much less obviously productive than something like physics or chemical engineering. Disaster can result. But if you imagine, Bill Gates' moral contention is that it was good to sell Microsoft to the public markets and then to use the resulting wealth to do everything that the Gates Foundation did. And a lot of people assume that there would be no moral upside to him keeping the company. But I actually don't think that's true. I mean, if you imagine if it remained a family business, then family stewards can take long-term moral stances, which publicly traded companies with, a sort of fiduciary duty to maximize shareholder value can't. So there's a lot of furor at the moment about Microsoft offshoring jobs. A private company would be under less sustained pressure to do that. There are wage pressures that are incumbent upon publicly traded companies in a way that profitable private firms can alleviate. And one of the things I look at is the business practices of Henry Ford, who obviously built a thriving business and indeed a thriving city of Detroit up until the time of his death, in part due to insistence on fair wages in the context of a perfectly profitable enterprise. Whereas again, in the context of market pressures, that potential is reduced, the defensibility of the decision to take above market wages. So you can imagine a sort of counterfactual where Microsoft and its family remained in San Francisco. They saw themselves as the kind of perpetual kings of San Francisco. Because one of the things that happens when you move from locally rooted charity to this kind of abstract philanthropy, which focuses on like things in Africa. The Gates family don't live in Africa. They don't focus on the local poor. They focus on the far off poor. So why live among the local poor? They can relocate to gated communities. And this is kind of documented in Charles Murray's Coming Apart as the increasing geographic isolation of the elite from everyone else. And, places like San Francisco and Virginia and so forth are just left to rot. But if you imagine, there is actually a lot that a rooted family with centuries long time view of cultivating a family business which supported a local community in a particular city could do to elevate the people around them. And it would be a very happy merger of accountability and profit. Unfortunately, what ended up happening was a total lack of accountability because Bill Gates became one of the wealthiest men in the world, but wasn't running a company and could live wherever he wanted, could do whatever he wanted. In many ways, it's very unhealthy because the Gates Foundation now wields political power comparable to major countries. I mean, for example, I'm not sure what the latest statistics are, but there was a time relatively recently when, if you look at the contributors to the World Health Organization, number one was the United States. Number three onwards were all major countries. And number two was the Gates Foundation. And it was a situation where basically any major, global health decision had to be passed through unofficially Bill Gates. And that kind of pattern has played out in the education sector in America and various other sectors where Bill Gates's vision of charity actually looks a lot like public governance, but he's not an elected official. He's not accountable to public mechanisms of redress. He's just kind of the shadow force that, in much the same way George Soros does, in US and international politics. For me, that's a much less transparent, accountable, long timeline, community-oriented vision of affecting the world. And I think it has serious problems.
Your story in the book about, I think it was Henry Ford II, actually gave me a sympathetic view of the Ford family that I maybe didn't have before, because he sort of realized what had happened after the fact. And he was involved in the process of sort of establishing the Ford Foundation and imbuing it with, this powers, but then it took on this life of its own. And after he realized what had happened, it was too late. And he basically lost control of the Ford Foundation, and he had to abdicate his throne, for lack of a better term. And it actually made me sympathetic to the Ford family. And it was, the lesson there was also, don't abdicate. Don't give up the throne. Figure out a way to maintain control in the family. It's sad because I imagine the Ford Foundation still exists and is quite powerful as it was when he lost control in the 50s.
Indeed, it is. Yeah, it's still it's not the largest as it was at its height, but it's still one of the largest foundations in the world. And yeah, I mean, if you wanted to sort of extract a single central contention from the book, it is that true charity is a necessarily multi-generational project, and there needs to be a continuous line of stewards with the same values, the same spiritual foundation to protect charitable investments. Otherwise, you get this extreme short-termist philosophy. There's an interesting challenge. I should look up his name. I remember reading this story a while ago. There was an Irish billionaire who committed to giving away all of his wealth within his lifetime. And I actually think that's sort of morally superior position to what the Giving Pledge guys do, which is, they'll live as the most rich and powerful people in the world until death takes their riches away, and then they won't give it to their children. They'll give it to charity. So they're not actually making a sacrifice during their own lifetimes. They're sort of making a sacrifice on behalf of their family after they're gone. And I appreciate the instinct to give it away during his lifetime. The problem he had is that if you looked at his life expectancy, his expected returns on the capital he already had, he would have to give away many millions of dollars every day to close out his fortune on that timescale. And that is a process that necessarily implicates waste, confusion, probably negative externalities as well, and certainly empowers, a class of grifters. The Ford Foundation was described by one historian as a large body of money surrounded by people who want some, and those are the sort of conditions you engender when you aggressively give money away outside of the stewardship of a family with an ultra long time horizon. So yeah, the Ford Foundation is a tragedy. It's a sort of multi-layered tragedy. I think it's a tragedy that they were forced to do that in the first place by extremely aggressive inheritance taxes. I think it's a tragedy that they, Edsel and Henry Ford I went to their deaths thinking that they'd set up a structure which, had made the best of a bad situation with those inheritance taxes and had created an institution which would go on to do tremendous good. I mean, you can imagine an alternate timeline in which having such a well-endowed institution attempting to engage in philanthropic causes would have widespread good effects. And then just watching Henry Ford II openly lament the complete loss of control of the foundation in the 70s is one of the great tragic American stories.
And what practical ideas or thoughts, Johann, do you have on leaving actual financial wealth? How do you align your estate in a way that makes this advantageous for multi-generational legacy?
One of the things I look at in the book is very counterintuitive by modern standards, but it's a philosophy of inheritance where you try and pass on assets which are illiquid as possible. This was both obvious and made more sense in the age of the aristocracy, when the majority of aristocratic holdings were anchored in physical estates, like actual landed estates, very ornate houses filled with art and other valuable objects, furniture, and so forth, well decorated, surrounded by productive land, which was used for agricultural, commercial, and to some extent residential purposes. And the beauty of this system is that when you pass on your wealth to your child, you are passing on something which affords them a life of tremendous beauty, yes, but also demands of them this very active stewardship. I mean, these estates are actually challenging to manage, to cultivate, to finance, and they come with an obligation of duty to everyone who derives a living from them, the local farmers, the artisans who, beautify them, the servants who maintain the family situation. And sometimes that extends into many, both within one generation, many servants, but also many generations of servants of the same family. So they're kind of the centerpiece of this whole economic order. And that is one of the ways that they both justify their privilege, but also perpetuate these virtuous children, is by giving them privileges which are completely and intimately tied up with commensurate duties. That's perhaps more difficult in the contemporary age because farming is a famously difficult business to generate contemporary income from, especially for when you get into the sort of ultra high net worth expectations. It's pretty difficult to live an aristocratic lifestyle only based on local farmlands now. So the question then is like, does this physical landed estate model still work? Probably not as it was practiced, but this sort of gets back to like the enculturation of the perfection of our current culture. I think at least we can make a defense of multi-generational family businesses. And so a lot of the book is devoted to the question of what form those family businesses should take, and then also charting a path through all of the difficult challenges that I'm sure many of your readers will be familiar with here, like, children who aren't interested in taking over the family business, or children who seem to be incompetent to take over the family business. There are some solutions that you can sort of implement even later in life if you find yourself in those difficult circumstances. But really the call of the book is to start raising children from birth according to practices as the aristocracy always have, which makes clear to children what your expectations of them are and binds their identity into this sort of greater family identity, such that they want to take on the reins of the family business. They're confident to take it on. And more than that, you've invested so much in the local community, in beautifying it and deepening your relationships with the local families and so forth, that they're extremely keen to continue living where they grew up because they recognize the beauty of it. They recognize the family's investment in that place. And you don't end up in the situation that a lot of people struggle with now, where their kids are very keen to just move to the city where, that's where the status is, that's where the sort of like trends take them to. But you've actually sort of created this jewel of a community around the family that is a very attractive and warm and hopefully ritualized place to stay.
Well said. You just published a book, and it's famously hard to make money on a book with indie publishing or maybe any publishing. However, it does strike me that there are multi-generational publishing legacies. like our friend J.R.R. Tolkien, I think his family still stewards that business. The James Bond legacy. That's not the Ian Fleming family, I don't think, but maybe someday the generations of Johann Kurtz will be republishing your book in new formats for the next century, if you will.
I appreciate your confidence in my little coffee table book, but no, I have to say it's been worthwhile for me writing this thing. I mean, we both, I think we follow a lot of blogs who have these brilliant ideas, but no real mechanism for cementing them in our civilizational consciousness, because a blog post is a fairly ephemeral thing, and it's a difficult thing to gift, and there's so many of them flying around. So my hope is that by challenging myself to distill the best of my ideas over the years into a digestible and shareable document, it might have some staying power.
Yeah. Hopefully, that there's a bit of a movement that you're in front of, maybe leading. And I've been following you for probably a few years now. And, I feel invested in your success. Like hopefully you feel that from your other supporters, but like, I want to see you kill it here. I want to see this become a bestseller. I want to see you on the Tim Ferriss podcast, speaking to the masses about this. And, yeah, if you win with this, Johann, that's a win for me. So I hope it does very, very well. And the book is excellent. Everyone needs to buy it. In fact, what wealth managers do is, every year, every time you get a new client, usually you'll gift them a good book. And that's, the Die with Zero thing sells a lot of copies with that. You should do, when you do signed copies, let me know. I'll buy a bunch of signed copies for my clients. You could also do events. Like we like to do events with people like you that you could travel the world and do events. But yeah, I think you're touching on something very important. I think you're right at the cusp of an important movement, and I think your book's going to be a big part of that.
I hugely appreciate it. Those are very kind words, and I'd love to pick your brain after the show on the tactical realities of implementing some of those excellent suggestions.
Wonderful. Well, hey, Johann, it's been a pleasure to speak with you. I know you're probably heavy on your speaking tour right now, so it means a lot that you took the time to come on the pod, and best of luck with the success of the book.
Thank you. No, yeah, the book is Leaving a Legacy, Inheritance, Charity, and 1,000-Year Families, and you can get it on Amazon in ebook, paperback, and a rather handsome hardcover. My wonderful wife designed the cover, so it's an aesthetic family. It's a family business all unto itself.
Wonderful. Yeah, the book looks great, and it's been a pleasure to speak with you.
No, likewise. Thank you so much for having me.